Hey there. So in this video I'm gonna talk to you about setting up your AOVs and creating your render passes, and then in the second part of the video I'm gonna composite them in Photoshop. But for now, my light setup is fairly simple. I have a key light, fill light, backlight and an HDRI, which I don't end up using, but these are my lights. And unfortunately I have to comment on this because when I recorded live the sound got really bad, unfortunately. So what I'm doing here is in the render settings I'm just adding some useful elements here. The first one is the ID pass, and I'm going to show later what all these are going to do, but for now, I pick the ID next to the Z. That's good for adding depth of field. Then we have, what else do I pick? Diffuse albedo. This is basically your color information. Diffuse direct, indirect. Diffuse is basically the lighting information, but it's missing the specular aspect. Then the specular, and you can break that up into direct and indirect as well, although I usually don't use that. I always end up just using the specular pass. I never found use for the indirect spec, but I know people use it, so I included it here. And then I add a new custom one. It's really simple. You just press add custom, and then I type AO, so that's going to be the ambient occlusion one. And for the shader, you just select the checker here, and if you type in the selected Arnold, then type in AiAmbient,occlusion, you can use that one. I find the standard default settings work really well, and obviously you can change levels and all that stuff inside of Photoshop, so I'm not too concerned with that here. I add a new one, a mask also. So for the mask you can do the same thing. For this one I'm gonna use an AiFlat, and that's just gonna give you a flat color. So for this one I will choose a white color, and then the background, since there's nothing in the scene, will be black, so that's giving us a good mask to work with. Let's see. What other passes could I choose? Still explaining something here. Alright, what else? I think next would be actually the lights. But I'm gonna do that in a second. For now I'm just testing it. Okay, now. So for the lights you just have to go into the attribute editor, and in the AOV light group you give it any name. Hopefully that makes sense, so it's easy to remember, but that's all that is to it. And once that's done, you can go back into the render settings, which I will do in a second. Yes. Oh, actually I'm going to show you in a second, because what I did was I used it for the diffuse, but actually when I do these individual lights, the way I use them in compositing is I want the beauty, so you can see that's the ambient occlusion. Seems to work. Not sure how much you can explain about that at this point, but alright, so that's the ID pass. As you can see, it's just giving each individual mesh a different color, and that's useful if you want to, let's say, change the color for just a specific object in Photoshop. You could simply color pick a range and then use it as a mask, so that's just giving you more control. I don't end up using it, but it's certainly nice. Next, yeah, the mask, you see it's working as expected. And if we move on, the Z, okay, so for this one, you actually have to play around with the slider, and the thing is, if you go all the way to -5, which is the maximum, by just dragging it, you won't see anything. So you have to type in individual values. So like -12 to 15, I find oftentimes it becomes visible. And the thing is, although you can change it in Photoshop, I found for some reason it doesn't work if it's completely white. You don't need to have it perfect, because Photoshop will do that, but it just needs to be visible. And that's pretty much all there's to. Oh yeah, and then you got to actually change the save image settings, but I'll get to that in a second, I believe. Okay, for now I'll move on, I'm gonna show in a second. Yeah, so this diffuse, you can see lighting information, color information, no specularity. This is just the color. And yeah, that's when I use diffuse, which it works as expected for individual lights, but I'd prefer to have the beauty, so I'm just going to change that in a second. Specular, also a very useful pass, I find. You can see direct, indirect, not much of a difference. I've never used it, but there's probably use for it, I'm sure. Okay, now I'm gonna actually show you how you can do the light. So if you add a custom, so you need the RGBA, but you want a custom RGBA underscore, and then you type in the name used in the attribute editor for the light. So the name that you picked here. That's pretty straightforward. HDRI, and then all these other names. And that's it. After that you can have these. So obviously you can render out each individual light if you wanted to. And you can do the same thing for every pass as much as you need. Maybe specularity from different light sources, but yeah, the cool thing is you can just hit render once and then you go do something else and come back to it, and you don't have to start multiple renders. So I'm gonna show you what I ended up with, and basically it's the beauty here at the bottom, and that's just used for the background. Then I have a bit of smoke that I put on normal mode, because basically we have on top of that the key light, so it works out fine. And then after that I have the backlight. The lights are at always on screen mode. You could also use linear dodge, which is similar, very similar, but just you always have to kind of try out a bunch of these to see which works best. Sometimes you find sort of happy accidents maybe, and I always do that, although for some I know what to use. But yeah, fill layer on screen mode, you can see this one is fairly subtle, because I like the contrast I have here, and it's just to get rid of the too black areas. You don't want to have it completely black like this. I would say is too dark, it's not appealing. So yeah, the fill I always keep fairly subtle. Next you have the specular pass, and for this one, if I disable the mask, you can see, since there's a lot of shiny specular areas here, it actually lightens it up quite a bit. So what I do here is add levels to it. So if you can see, now it's a bit more reduced and not that even, almost like a light source. It still is kind of, but that's why I have a mask here. So you can see with the mask, when I turn it on and off, I just enhanced some specular areas, and it's really just to give it a bit more pop. So kind of gives a bit more contrast and just a bit more pop, and I think it's nice visually. Next we have the ambient occlusion, which I also painted a mask, and I don't use it heavily most of the time here. I thought it's kind of fitting in the mouth. I didn't like that to be, I thought it looked confusing having it lit. So for the Z depth, what you need to do is you have your image, then you go to filter and, image, adjustments, and then HDR toning. And if you change the method to equalize histogram, then you can see it's giving you the perfect range from black to white. That's why it doesn't matter if you have it perfect inside of Maya, as long as it's visible, you can do this. And then after you copied it, you go into your channels and paste it into your alpha. Okay, so I group my layers now. I duplicate the group, and then I want to merge them all together, the one group. And after that, you can go ahead, go into image, or where is it? Is it filter, actually, blur, lens blur. And if you hit that, usually by default, it's already selected. You can see that your source alpha 1. So it's taking this image that we pasted in. If not, then you just need to change it. But it's kind of looking confusing here. There's the smoke kind of extending. Okay, you can see for now I'm just gonna go with this kind of weirdness going on. I'm gonna crop it later, but you can see the source we selected alpha 1, which is what we set up earlier. Then you can pick a focal point if you want. For example, here the head, and you can see the blur effect being there accordingly. And then there are some settings you can try out and adjust your blur. For example, the focal distance, which is what we set with a focal point. And then there's also some more settings. I usually just use these, and then the radius. And the other ones I didn't really touch. For your overall depth of field, I think these are sufficient in my experience. What's the other one? Specular highlights and noise. And you can see it looks pretty good, I think. Alright, so lastly, or not lastly, but next I'm gonna talk about the camera raw filter, and this one is really fun. So many options and very straightforward. So first, what we can do, which is maybe most fun, so you can change black and white if you want to, and then here if you browse the profiles, you can basically check out some presets, which some look pretty cool on their own, and it's good for inspiration maybe. It's just quick to shuffle through them and just get inspired, or pick some of them and then adjust them further. Some black and white options, all very interesting. I think the vintage ones look pretty cool too. I actually like this one with a greenish tone, or this one actually too. But let's look at how we can achieve these things ourselves. So first we have the temperature, like the color temperature on your lights in Arnold. You can see from cool to warm. We could leave that for now, because I'm gonna go into different settings later that kind of work in the same area. You could adjust the tint here. And then exposure, it's kind of dark. We could ramp that up, but I don't like to use exposure. Since I like the contrast, I'm gonna go. I could increase that. That's probably too much though. I like increasing the highlights sometimes. You can see that's just kind of. I find it looks more realistic actually. The highlights is one thing that I found really adds to it. And just more contrast. You could also make the shadows darker, which I don't like areas to be too dark as I said earlier, so I'm not gonna do that. The whites, you could increase these, which I don't like doing too much. It kind of like the highlights just a bit different, and it blows out the whites fairly quickly, so I'd rather increase the brightness here over the highlight. And then the blacks equally. You could actually, if you don't want areas too black, you could increase that, but then it's taking away from the contrast obviously. And then another one, if we zoom in, we can see probably in the face best, the texture is interesting because you can see it's almost like a sharpen, but I think more subtle, probably a bit more, I wouldn't say better, it's different. Can't really speak of how or what's exactly happening here, but I usually like a bit of that. Then clarity, also like a sharpen. Yeah, I like that too actually. It definitely brings out more detail, which is probably a good thing, but I wouldn't overdo it. Maybe, I mean, it's a matter of taste as well. Maybe that's a bit harsh already. I kind of like the grungy look though. Dehaze, yeah, dehaze, it's what it's supposed to do. You can see, I mean, the smoke is perfect for dehazing obviously, but we want that, so maybe we want it even more hazy. Vibrance, it's basic. I'm no expert on this, admittingly, so I can't say what it's doing exactly, but I know it's just increasing the saturation, but for just, I believe, certain color ranges and more subtle, but don't take my word for it. And then saturation, that's self-explanatory, I believe. Next we have the tone curve, so here we could really adjust the levels with this curve. We also can pick a custom one, medium contrast, strong, linear, whichever we want. We have the channels here if we want, but let's leave that for now. So now we have sharpening again if we want to, or not again. We have the real sharpening, which I would probably add a touch of it. You can reduce the noise. I don't see any noise really here, so that's good. You can, then it's just the saturation hue luminance for your individual colors, which, you know, you could, for example, we have the greens here, we could adjust them this way if we wanted to. And then split toning is one I find really interesting. So you basically have your highlights and your shadows. So let's say we want the classic cool warm color, what's the name? Anyway, so let's just see what it does. Here we can select a range. Let's take something warm, and you can see once I increase the saturation here, it's giving us this warm color to our highlights, and then we could go on the shadows and make it a more bluish tone, and then it's really, yes, like the name suggests, splitting it up, and that's, I really like that one. I think it's very effective. Obviously it's heavily stylized, so you know, you have to use it with purpose obviously. It looks really cinematic. I know there are some movies that use this kind of split toning, especially I was the one by Michael Bay, The Island. and I think transformers as well, they do that, and I find it looks cool, but it's all a matter of taste, obviously. So yeah, there's lots of variables to play around with. You can go crazy with it, actually. It's really fun. So next one, vignetting. So very classic, obviously. Usually always use a black vignette, but since it's so dark here, I think a brighter vignette would work well. You can adjust the midpoint, so if we crank that up to see the effect, we can see that's how far inside it reaches. Yeah, I think adding some more contrast here with some more brighter vignetting works pretty good too. And then you can add grain, which is also very, it's a style choice, which it's a specific look. If you like it, go for it. But I think I actually use a slide one here. Next one, we have some more calibration here. I didn't use that one really, so I'm not going to comment on that for now. And yeah, then there's some presets again. So, you know, plenty of options. I don't use these presets here either, so I'm not going to comment on that either, or neither. And but yeah, that's it. I'm gonna press cancel for now and show you that's the original one, and then I can show you what I put on top of that. So you can see actually it's very. I definitely increased the highlight quite a bit, added a lot more contrast to it. And yeah, it's very stylized. I probably have to look at it again in a couple of days to get my eyes fresh and see, but I kind of like, it looks cinematic. I always like doing the cinematic kind of images. A bit over the top probably, but that's just my personal taste. And then what I did lastly was, you can see if I disable the mask here, just a bit of dust particles. I tend to use that not too heavily, but I find it's just a different layer of complexity, just a bit more of information about the surrounding that makes it feel a tiny bit more grounded, so to speak. And then another one here, and that's pretty much it. That's hopefully was helpful and you got some ideas, especially the camera raw filter. I think obviously can even do a lot of work for you if you want, and it's not nothing crazy I did here, just some layering here on mostly screen mode, linear dodge, AO on multiply to just affect the dark areas and make them darker. And there are more blending modes that obviously apply to different cases, but I think these render paths that I got here with the specular different lights is probably what you usually would use, or at least I use and I see a lot of people use. So, and the Z depth obviously is useful. So I hope this gives you a good overview of just some tools to really composite your final renders and hopefully present your 3D model in the best possible light. And so yeah, if you liked the video and found it helpful in some way, I appreciate obviously if you leave a like. That helps out the channel, and a subscription if you want to see more like this. Feel free to do that too.